Sometimes a voice can create one of the most powerful moments in television history. And when that voice cut through the laughter and applause of Studio 6B at 30 Rockefeller Plaza, everything changed in an instant. Jimmy Fallon, the man who had interviewed thousands of celebrities, who had navigated countless unexpected moments with his trademark smile and quick wit, suddenly found himself speechless. The cameras kept rolling, but the show had stopped. Millie Bobby Brown was mid-sentence, talking about her latest project, when the voice reached her ears. A voice she hadn't heard in 3 years. A voice that belonged to someone she thought she'd never see again. Without warning, without explanation, she stood up from the guest chair and walked off the stage, leaving Jimmy and millions of viewers around the world wondering what had just happened. But this moment didn't come out of nowhere. Behind the scenes, something extraordinary had been set in motion, something that would prove Jimmy Fallon wasn't just a talk show host. He was someone who understood that sometimes, television's greatest power lies not in entertainment, but in healing. If you want to understand how one voice changed everything that night, subscribe now because this story is about much more than a celebrity interview gone wrong. The Tonight Show starring Jimmy Fallon was in full swing on that Tuesday evening in October. Studio 6B buzzed with its usual electric energy as the audience settled in for another night of comedy, games, and celebrity interviews. Jimmy had already delivered his monologue to thunderous applause, and the Roots provided their signature musical backdrop as he prepared for his first guest of the evening. Millie Bobby Brown walked onto the stage with the confidence that came from years of being in the spotlight. At 19, she had already conquered both television and film, becoming one of the most recognizable young faces in entertainment. The audience erupted as she waved and took her seat across from Jimmy's desk. "Millie Bobby Brown, everybody!" Jimmy announced with his characteristic enthusiasm, his smile genuine and warm. "Thank you so much for being here. You look amazing tonight." Millie beamed back at him, settling into the familiar rhythm of late-night television. They talked about her upcoming projects, shared some behind-the-scenes stories from Stranger Things, and the audience laughed at all the right moments. Everything was going exactly as scripted. But in the wings of the studio, someone was watching. Someone who had been waiting for this exact moment. Someone whose presence there that night was no accident. Jimmy stopped mid-joke. The entire studio froze. It happened during what should have been a light-hearted segment about Millie's experiences growing up on camera. Jimmy had just asked about her favorite memories from the set, and she was in the middle of sharing a funny story about working with her co-stars when the voice cut through the studio atmosphere like a blade. "Millie." Just one word. Spoken softly, but with enough power to carry across the studio and reach the microphones. The voice was older, weathered by time and emotion, but unmistakably familiar to anyone who truly knew Millie Bobby Brown. The young actress stopped speaking immediately. Her face went white, and her hands began to tremble slightly. She turned toward the source of the voice, her eyes scanning the darkness beyond the stage lights. Jimmy noticed the change instantly. After years of hosting, he had developed an almost supernatural ability to read his guests, to sense when something was wrong. He saw the way Millie's posture changed, the way her breathing became shallow, the way her eyes filled with a mixture of shock and something that looked like desperate hope. "Millie?" Jimmy said gently, his voice barely audible over the confused murmur that was beginning to ripple through the audience. "Are you okay?" But Millie wasn't listening to Jimmy anymore. She was staring into the shadows beyond the cameras, searching for the source of that voice. And then she saw him. An elderly man, probably in his 70s, was standing just at the edge of the stage area. He was thin, wearing a simple button-down shirt and slacks, and he was looking directly at Millie with eyes that held 3 years' worth of unshed tears. Without a word, without any explanation to Jimmy or the confused audience, Millie Bobby Brown stood up from her chair and began walking toward the man. The studio erupted in whispered confusion, but she didn't hear any of it. All she could hear was her heart pounding in her chest. "Grandpa?" she whispered, her voice breaking. Behind the scenes, Fallon made a decision that defied every producer's expectation. In any normal television scenario, what happened next would have been immediate damage control. Producers would have cut to commercial, security would have intervened, and the show would have resumed after sorting out whatever personal drama was unfolding on stage. But Jimmy Fallon wasn't thinking like a television producer in that moment. He was thinking like a human being. He watched as Millie reached the elderly man and collapsed into his arms, both of them crying openly now. He could see the audience straining to understand what was happening, some people standing up in their seats to get a better view. The cameras were still rolling, but the show had ceased to be a show. It had become something else entirely. Jimmy made a decision that would define his career. Instead of calling for a commercial break, instead of trying to regain control of the situation, he stood up from behind his desk. He loosened his tie, a gesture that would later become symbolic of this moment, and walked around to the front of the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jimmy said, his voice carrying easily through the studio's sound system. "Sometimes life gives us moments that are more important than television. And I think we're witnessing one of those moments right now." The audience fell silent. Even the Roots stopped their subtle background accompaniment. In the control room, producers were frantically gesturing and talking into their headsets, but Jimmy had made his choice. He approached Millie and the elderly man slowly, respectfully, giving them space but making it clear that whatever was happening, it was welcome here. "Sir," Jimmy said gently to the man. "I'm Jimmy. Is everything okay here?" The elderly man looked up at Jimmy, still holding Millie in his arms. His face was wet with tears, but he was smiling. "I'm Robert," he said, his voice shaky with emotion. "I'm Millie's grandfather. I haven't seen her in 3 years. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead." The story that unfolded in those next few minutes would later be called one of the most genuine moments in late-night television history. But to understand why this reunion was so significant, and why it happened on Jimmy Fallon's stage, you have to understand what had led to 3 years of separation. Robert Brown had been Millie's closest family member during her early childhood. When her career began to take off and she started traveling constantly for filming, their relationship had remained strong through phone calls and video chats. But as Millie's fame grew, so did the protective barriers around her. Managers, agents, and well-meaning family members had gradually limited access to her, worried about her privacy and security. Robert, living alone in a small apartment in Ohio, had watched his granddaughter become a global superstar from a distance. Their communication had slowly dwindled, not through any ill will, but through the simple reality that Millie's life had become impossibly complicated and scheduled down to the minute. The last time they had spoken was after her 16th birthday party, which Robert hadn't been able to attend due to his own health issues and the logistical challenges of her security requirements. The call had been brief, interrupted by other obligations, and somehow it had become their last real conversation. For 3 years, Robert had watched every interview, every red carpet appearance, every social media post, feeling both proud of his granddaughter's success and heartbroken by their lost connection. He had tried reaching out through official channels, but his calls and letters got lost in the machinery of celebrity management. 2 weeks before this Tonight Show appearance, Robert had received devastating news from his doctor. His health was declining rapidly, and he might not have much time left. That's when he made the decision that brought him to Studio 6B that night. He had written a letter to Jimmy Fallon. But this is the moment no one in the studio, and no one watching at home, ever saw coming. Robert's letter to Jimmy had been heartfelt but simple. He wasn't asking for special treatment, or trying to exploit his granddaughter's fame. He was just a grandfather who wanted to see Millie one more time, and he believed that Jimmy, known for his genuine kindness and family values, might understand. The letter had found its way to Jimmy personally, and when he read it, he was deeply moved. But rather than simply arranging a private meeting, Jimmy had worked with his team to orchestrate something more meaningful. They had contacted Millie's representatives and explained the situation, but instead of arranging a reunion backstage, Jimmy had suggested something bolder. What if they could give Robert and Millie a moment that honored their relationship publicly? What if they could show the world that behind all the glamour and fame, the most important connections are still the simplest ones? Millie had agreed immediately when she learned about her grandfather's letter. She hadn't known he was sick, hadn't realized how much he had been trying to reach her. The guilt and love and relief had all mixed together when she learned he would be at the show. But even knowing he was going to be there, hearing his voice in that studio had overwhelmed her completely. Now, standing on the stage with Jimmy facilitating this moment, Robert reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a small, worn photograph. It was a picture of him and Millie from when she was 7 years old, before the fame, before the complexity. They were sitting on his front porch, both of them laughing at something just outside the frame. "I've carried this every day for 3 years," Robert said, showing the photo to Millie. "Every day I've missed you." Millie took the photograph with shaking hands. When she looked at it, the weight of everything she had lost in pursuit of her dreams hit her all at once. The audience, many of whom were now crying themselves, watched as she pressed the photo to her chest and hugged her grandfather even tighter. Jimmy stood nearby, no longer thinking about television or audiences or ratings. He was thinking about his own family, about the moments that matter most, about the responsibility that comes with having a platform. "Robert," Jimmy said quietly, "would you like to sit with us for a few minutes? Would you like to tell everyone about Millie before she was famous?" Robert's face lit up through his tears. "I would love that," he said. What followed was unlike anything that had ever happened on The Tonight Show. Jimmy brought out a chair for Robert, and the three of them sat together on the stage. Robert told stories about Millie's childhood, about her first attempts at acting in his living room, about the way she used to make him laugh when she practiced different accents. The studio audience was completely silent, hanging on every word. In the control room, the producers realized they were witnessing something special and decided to let it continue. This wasn't going to be a normal show, and that was perfectly fine. Millie, still holding the photograph, shared her own memories of their time together. She talked about how her grandfather had been the first person to believe in her dreams, how he had driven her to early auditions when her parents were working, how he had been her biggest supporter before she became famous enough to have fans. "I'm so sorry," she said to him, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm so sorry I let everything get in the way. I never wanted to lose you." "You didn't lose me," Robert said, taking her hand. "I've been right here the whole time, watching you make the world a better place. I'm so proud of you, sweetheart." The photograph that Robert had carried became the symbol of their reunion, but it represented something larger. Jimmy, recognizing the power of the moment, made another decision that would become legendary. He reached into his own pocket and pulled out his phone. "Robert, Millie," he said, "would you mind if we took a new picture? One for the next 3 years? Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten." The photograph that Jimmy took that night, Millie and Robert sitting together on the Tonight Show stage, both of them smiling through their tears, became one of the most shared images in social media history. But more than that, it became a symbol of Jimmy Fallon's approach to hosting and to life. After the show, Jimmy spent another hour with Millie and Robert in his dressing room. They talked about family, about the challenges of fame, about the importance of holding on to the people who matter most. Robert shared more stories, Millie made promises to stay in better touch, and Jimmy simply listened, understanding that sometimes the best thing a host can do is create space for real human connection. The episode aired exactly as it happened, with no editing, no commercial breaks during the reunion, no attempt to package the emotion for easier consumption. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Viewers called it the most genuine moment they had ever seen on television. Robert lived for 8 more months after that night. He and Millie spoke every week, sometimes every day. When he passed away peacefully in his sleep, Millie was holding his hand. At his funeral, she carried that same worn photograph in her pocket, the one he had kept for 3 years. Jimmy Fallon kept a copy of the new photograph they took that night on his desk. Whenever the pressures of television felt overwhelming, whenever the industry demanded he choose ratings over humanity, he looked at that picture and remembered what really mattered. Sometimes a voice can change everything. Sometimes television's greatest power isn't making people laugh, it's bringing them home.